Good morning, afternoon, and hello. Welcome to our webinar, A Nonprofit's Guide to Wage and Hour. My name is Max Smith, and I'm the Marketing Manager for 501c Services. Sonia, you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Alrighty.
Before we get kind of going into it, I hope everybody saw in our email and when you joined us this morning that we do have a handout. So if you go down in the handout section of your go-to webinar platform here, there's a PDF, and there's a little quiz that Sonia's going to walk us through about wage and hour. Don't worry, we won't record how well you did, but you can go ahead and download that and start reading through it if you haven't already, because that's going to be one of the items that she's going to work on with you all today. As I said, I'm Max Smith. This is 501c Services. We are a 100% employee-owned company, and we provide alternatives to state-run unemployment insurance programs. We provide these services to more than 1,500 nonprofits nationally. Part of what we do is we administer the 501c Agencies Trust, which is actually it's a comprehensive suite of risk management services and has multiple stop-loss protections for 501c3s. We also have a program called You Insure, which is a first dollar unemployment insurance program that's not only available to nonprofits, but tribally owned businesses and government entities as well. A number of you with us this morning, this afternoon, already working with us, and we really appreciate you doing business with us and look forward to working with you in the years to come. Okay, Sonia, you can go to the next slide for me. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started here. If you have any questions, Sonia's going to take questions as we go. And as we said when we got on this morning, she's going to try to be as interactive as possible. So don't wait until the end. If she's talking about a certain subject matter and you want a question answered right there, we're going to be monitoring the questions really well this morning so that she can answer those as we go. Secondly, a copy of today's presentation, the PowerPoint deck, and a video copy will be forwarded to everybody later today. So you'll get a copy of everything if you need to share it or you need to review it at a later date with yourself or with staff. Those of you looking for recertification credits, we do have the full plate of them today for HR and for certified nonprofit executives. What you just need to do is there's a survey at the end of all of this. You just need to let us know which certification credit you're looking for. That way I can forward you the appropriate one later this week. I should be able to get everything out before the end of the week tomorrow. And also, you know, we do these periodically. We try to do one once a month for people who are not customers of us. We do several every month for our customers. So we'll hope you come back and join us again in the future. Okay, Sonia, you can next slide, please. So now that we have all that question and answer stuff out of the way this morning, the logistics are done, I'm going to introduce everybody to today's presenter, Sonia. Most of you probably already know Sonia if you work with us. She's a superstar here at 501c Services. She's my coworker, and I'm very excited to be having her with me today. I don't feel alone, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her. And just go ahead and take it away, Sonia. Thank you.
Thanks, Mac. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Mac had just let me know that while I was getting my morning coffee, he had just finished lunch. So anyway, just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. We are going to be starting with a quiz. All the questions, and maybe you've already gone through it, I hope. It shouldn't take too long. I want you to go with your gut. They're all true and false except for the last bonus question. Don't overthink it. You know, wage and hour is never as simple as people would like to believe. You know, let's face it, complying with the FLSA is one of the most confusing and challenging things managers have to do. And even the most savvy HR practitioners get tripped up because the law's complex requirements can easily land us and our organizations on the wrong side of a lawsuit or a Department of Labor investigation. Fact here, there are more wage and hour lawsuits pending in the federal courts than all other employment claims combined. 90% of class action lawsuits are wage and hour lawsuits. So I wanted to, before we here's the agenda, but before we get into this, Mac mentioned it earlier. I want this to be as interactive as possible. And depending upon time, my goal is to answer questions as we go along. So I want this to be personal to you and your organization. So here we go. Now, I'm hoping all of you have taken the quiz. We're just going to start. Number 1, the FLSA stands for the Federal Laborious Standards Act. True or false? False. FLA stands for the Fair Labor Standards Act, and not, as I heard recently at a legal conference, they refer to it as the FLSA as fees lawyers slobber after, because FLSA claims tend to be very high-dollar lawsuits. Now, I had another colleague that used to call it just the Fair Labor Act. And while that fits the standards, it's important because this is the federal law that establishes and governs the minimum laws regarding minimum wage, overtime, record keeping, youth employment, etc. And it is administered by the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. Next question. The FLSA only applies to non-exempt workers. True or false? True. Exempt positions are excluded from minimum wage, overtime regulations, and other rights and protections that are afforded to non-exempt workers. The federal minimum wage is currently $7.25 an hour. True. My question to you is, are you all aware, and I'm sure the answer is yes, of what your state and or local minimum wage is? Next question. States can set their own daily overtime. True or false? True. States, cities, and counties, except in the state of Oklahoma, have the right to set their own laws covering this area. We've got a couple questions, and I swear I'm going to get to those, so I'm going to move on. Now, when there's a discrepancy, in order for them to be enforceable, how do you know which one is the law that you're supposed to follow? The rule of thumb is that it has to meet or exceed the federal standard. So whatever is most beneficial to the employee is the law that you go by when it comes to wage and hour, or when there's a discrepancy between state and federal law for employment purposes. Federal law always trumps state law. True or false? False. Just like we were just talking about. When there's a conflict between state and federal law, you've got to choose the one that is most beneficial to the employee, not the employer. Non-exempt staff need not be paid for hours worked over 40 hours in a week. True or false? False. The simple version is you pay 1.5 times the regular rate of pay for all hours worked over 40 hours in a work week, or 8 hours in a day, depending on what state you're in. And I want to stress that this is not a pay period. This is per work week that you, as the employer, get to decide what that is. The FLSA has strict record-keeping requirements for all non-exempt employees. True or false? True. You've got to have compliance posters, and those compliance posters must contain the provisions of the FLSA, among many other things, in all work sites. They have to contain a list of basic records, the FLSA, your record-keeping requirements. That's a basic list of records that the employer must maintain, as well as complete and accurate timekeeping. So, for example, the things that you already track probably without even knowing that you're required to. Obviously the employee's full name, social security number, address, their birthday if they're under 19, time and day of the week when the employee's work week begins, hours worked each day, total hours worked each work week. And here's the interesting thing that I believe will be challenged soon, except for the occupation. They want to know the sex of the worker, whether you're male or female. And we have had calls on the hotline asking if they can forego asking that, sex or gender, correct. So, and that's, Jessica brought up a good point. She says sex or gender. On the forms, they're asking for the person's sex, which in the past meant your gender, male or female. Now, as we all know, things are changing in that area. However, the law still requires you to pick male or female. And I'm saying that in a few years, I think that requirement is going to change, and that will not be required for you to track. So, and the list goes on. There's so many other things that they want you to track and keep a list of. Oops, there we go. To qualify under the white collar exemption, you must wear a white collared shirt to work. False. So, oops, excuse me. You know, what happens is that the term white collared tends to, the term white collar work used to characterize, non-manual workers. Picture that denim work shirt. Blue collared workers typically did manual work or work where they used their hands. Today, it typically refers to employees whose work is knowledge-intensive, non-routine, and unstructured. So here it is straight from the FLSA. The FLSA provides an exemption from both minimum wage and overtime pay for employees who are employed in a bona fide executive, administrative, professional, outside sales capacity, computer profession, and there are approximately 30 other exemptions. Most of us are familiar with the ones that I just read. We've got a question here. Is it natural sex or identified gender? Jessica, that's a great question, and unfortunately, we do not have a clear answer on that. They have not. Department of Labor has not tackled that yet. So, good questions. Whether it's, I would say that to be in compliance with their intention, it would be natural sex. But who knows I think that will change in the future. But right now, I would go with natural sex. But you each get to make that decision yourself. Next question. To be exempt means to be excluded from receiving overtime pay for working over 40 hours in a work week. True or false? That is true. Exempt simply means excluded from. In this case, excluded from receiving overtime pay for hours worked over 40 hours or in a work week. You cannot require an exempt employee to keep track of their time. True or false? False. The FLSA does not prohibit employers from requiring exempt employees to work a particular schedule or to track the hours that they work. So, for example, let's say you have a manager who manages mostly non-exempt employees who work between 8 and 5. As the employer, you can require that exempt manager to work those same hours. The question, why? Because they need to be there to properly supervise and be there to support their employees. The Department of Labor also allows for recording daily attendance, and your organization can track hours without affecting an exempt employee's exempt status. But remember, your hours tracking should typically be for work billed to a grant or federal contract. Tracking hours must be unrelated to the employee's pay. Make sure that you tie any exempt staff's required schedule to exempt job duties like supervision. Don't focus on the number of hours worked. There is a three-pronged test for determining exempt, non-exempt status. All three areas must be met. True or false? True. Definitely. And that three-pronged test is, you have to make sure that you comply with all three areas, not just one or two. All three areas must be met. And those test areas are salary level, salary basis, job duties, and job duties. Now, staff that have management or decision-making responsibilities, that's what this means. Most employees should be non-exempt in your organization. White-collar exemptions are construed very narrowly and are intended to be the exception and not the norm. Next question. If I pay my employees a salary, they are automatically exempt. True or false? False. This is a common thing that we hear on the hotline. People think that if they pay somebody a salary and they refer to them as salaried employees, that means that they're exempt, and that is not true. So it's become commonplace to equate the word salaried with exempt. However, the words have two completely different meanings under the law. When an employee is salaried, it simply means the employer has chosen to pay that person a fixed amount per week or year. When an employee is exempt, it means that their position meets a specific definition under the law, and therefore means that they are not entitled to overtime and then other benefits, requirements, or protections that apply to non-exempt employees only. We've got a question here. Can an employer require an exempt staff to take vacation time if their business closes early for a snow day? Example, the employee worked 2 hours and is told to take the remaining 6 as vacation time. Typically, in that situation, no. You would, with an exempt staff person, they are ready, willing, and able to work, and the employer is making the decision. So you would not have them take that as vacation time. So that's typically the practice. If I pay my employees at least $25,000, that's at the federal level, and pay them a salary, they are automatically exempt. True or false? False. Remember that three-part test: minimum salary, paid on a salary basis, and job duties. So let's talk a little bit about that minimum salary. This is the easiest part. This is the easiest test. That employee, that position, needs to be paid a minimum salary of $455 a week, or that works out to $23,660 a year. I'm going to encourage you to look at it on a weekly basis and not an annual basis. Then there's the salary basis test. This is another simple part. That means that the employee is paid a salary. That means that they regularly receive a predetermined amount of compensation each pay period. You can't reduce the pay due to quality or quantity of the work that's performed. You must pay their full salary in any week in which the employee performs any work, except in the first and final week of employment. Now, there are allowable deductions, but we're not going to get into that today because of time. So that first and final week of employment, so if somebody starts on a Tuesday, you don't have to pay them for the Monday. And same with when they're leaving. If somebody leaves on a Monday, you only pay them for the Monday. The FLSA does allow for that. And they need not be paid for any work week where no work is performed. And that no work means no texting, no emails via phone or taking calls. It's no work. And I really encourage you to audit your payroll quarterly and annually. If you have employees who are at that bare minimum of $1,660. That's why I encourage you to look at it on a weekly basis, and that minimum is $455. So make sure that they don't fall below that, because if they do, for whatever reason, they're no longer legally exempt because they have fallen below that minimum salary. So we have another question here. What about hourly employees and snow days? For non-exempt staff, you can require them to take vacation. You have a little bit more flexibility. You have a lot more flexibility with your hourly employees. Seems a little unfair, but that's just the way it is. Another question. If the employee has already moved through their PTO and is taking additional days, we do have to pay for the time. No, because you have a bona fide PTO or benefit policy. So what I would do there, legally you can deduct if they're out of time. I'm not sure I would do it. I would probably let them just go into the hole, and have a negative balance. Another question, can I elaborate on when and why it's appropriate to track exempt employee hours? Ramona, I'm going to ask you to email me the question rather than trying to keep track of this. We have about 200 people on this, so if you could email me afterwards, we can talk, but I'll quickly answer that. So a lot of nonprofits have grants that require you to track the employees who are working on that grant, their hours, so that the grantee or grantor knows how much time is being spent. So that's when it would be a good idea. And lawyers do it all the time. Doctors do it as well. So that's sort of when you would do it. And you may require people to clock in and not clock in and clock out, but to track when they come in for safety reasons. If something were to happen, a situation where you had to evacuate the building and you're counting heads, but nobody knows whether or not Ramona came in or Carrie came in, those things are important to, perhaps to track in a large organization. So Andrea has a question. I thought the base for exempt was raised to 40 plus. That it was not raised. That did not go into effect. So we'll go back a bit. I didn't talk about the overtime exemption, the Obama rule. That did not go into effect. So we will probably see an increase in that base, but what we've heard through the grapevine is that that'll be probably around $33,000. But don't, that's a crystal ball look based on people we know that have connections to the Wage and Hour Division. Nothing has happened yet. They've shelved it. There was the injunction summary judgment, so that has gone away for now. All right, let's go on here. If you supervise anyone, you are automatically exempt. True or false? False. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail on job duties. It's definitely the more complicated part. So we're going to talk about the executive exemption. So to qualify for a position to qualify under the executive exemption, that position's primary duty is management of an organization, a subdivision, department, program, etc. That's typically your CEO, your COO, CFO, a program director, perhaps an HR director in a larger organization. They perform a set of recognized management duties like budgeting, creating work schedules, directing the work of their employees, hiring, training, coaching, counseling, etc. And some states have pretty strict requirements that the majority of that person's time needs to be spent on these duties. The federal requirements do not require a minimum amount of time. However, they do talk about the predominant emphasis needs to be on those things. Also, they need to regularly direct 2 or more full-time employees. What that means is that they must direct 80 hours of paid work. So that could be 2 full-time employees. It could be 3 combination employees, maybe 1 full-time and 2 part-timers. It could be 4 part-timers. However, it must be 80 hours of paid work and it must be paid staff. Volunteers don't count because they're not paid. So with this, they also have to have the authority to hire and fire their own employees, or because some organizations, the executive director or CEO maintains that authority, their recommendations as to hiring and firing, promotions or demotions must carry particular weight. They do not have to have unilateral authority to hire, fire, promote, etc. However, they need to have a strong role in the process in order to meet this part of the executive exemption. If the manager and supervisor does have the authority, make sure that is in their job description, because that just strengthens that. So it looks like we've got a couple of questions here. I'm going to see, I'll get to a couple of them looking at time. We are running a little short, so let me see here. If your state wage base is higher than the federal, then my assumption is the state rules per the earlier quiz question. You are correct. Can an employer require an exempt staff to take vacation in increments if part of the day is worked? So, for example, an employee works 7 hours and leaves 1 hour early for a personal appointment. I would never require an exempt employee to take 1 hour of time. That's treating somebody like an like a non-exempt employee hour for hour. Because the assumption is that when you have an exempt staff, that staff person works a minimum of 40 hours per week, unless their set hours are, let's say, 35. So they don't get anything. Okay, so drawing the line, that's a good question. I would say at 4 hours. So if you have somebody that comes in for 4 hours, half a day, and then you require them to take 4 hours of sick time or vacation time, that's what you can do. I would not do it, but it's okay to do that. All right. So remember, if that person has authority to hire and fire, etc., make sure you add that to their job description. Next question. Oh. If you occasionally perform exempt duties, you will be considered exempt. True or false? False. This needs to be all, customarily and regularly, not the occasional suggestion or performing those duties on a part-time, not regular basis. It does not include isolated or one-time tasks. Your exempt duties need to be work that is normally and recurrently performed every work week. Next question. If you are exempt, you will always be paid your full salary for the week, even if you run out of vacation and sick time or quit your job on a Tuesday. False. We talked about this earlier, the FLSA provision that you don't have to be paid for a full week in your first and final week of employment if you are exempt. Now, if the organization, we hit on this a little bit earlier, if the organization has a bona fide time off policy and an exempt employee runs out of accrued time, you may deduct pay in full day increments only. No partial day deductions. You will, if you do a partial day deduction, that person is considered legally no longer exempt. So full day increments only. I would not advise it at all to do the full day increments either, but legally you can. If you don't qualify as exempt under the executive exemption, however, you supervise 2 part-time employees, perform high-level, non-repetitive tasks, you may qualify as exempt under the administrative exemption. True or false? True. So now let's take a look at the administrative exemption. Mac, if you can kind of check where I am here, I'm going to go on due to time, and we'll come back to these questions afterwards.
Gotcha.
Let's take a look. Thank you. Let's take a look at the administrative exemption. This exemption is the most elusive and imprecise. It's the one that tends to be where we want to slot employees into when they don't quite make it into one of the other categories of exempt staff. It's the most likely to trip us up, and it's the one that is most reviewed and incorrect. This exemption is for employees that manage a process and not necessarily many employees or a department. Now, they might. However, think about it as managing a process. These positions keep the business running. It's often behind the scenes work. The administrative exemption's primary duties would be the performance of office or non-manual, meaning non-routine, non-repetitive work that is directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer's organization or the customers. So I'm a prime example here. I don't supervise anybody, but I work with our customers on a regular basis and do high-level work with our members. So this could be your finance director, your HR director in small organizations, maybe your fund development manager, again, in small organizations. So maybe they have a staff of 1, or they have 2 part-time staff, but that doesn't equal that 80 hours. Their primary duty needs to include the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. So what does that mean? It means that that person, that position, has the ability to make decisions which represent a responsible choice and for which there is an understanding of what is lawful, right, and or wise. You are also typically free from control of others. You are self-reliant and have the ability to make decisions or form that authoritative opinion. That position has the power to make big decisions and or have input on matters of consequences to the organization and or your customers' organizations. Again, like the executive, this is all customarily and regularly. It's frequently, not every now and then. This does not include isolated or one-time tasks. This is work that is normally and recurrently performed. And these tasks done must have a significant and substantial effect on the whole organization. If I have the power to make big decisions and or have input on matters of consequences to my organization or my customer's organization, I may be exercising discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance, and that means I may qualify as exempt under the administrative exemption. True or false? True. We just talked about that. The FLSA mandates that all organizations must provide meal and break periods. False. Sensible as this seems, employers are not legally required to allow breaks, at least by federal law. That is left up to each and every state. Now, in some states, workers have a lot more protection than in others. Your organization, if your state does not require it, has the right to define meals and breaks. Now, even though the FLSA doesn't mandate meals and breaks, it does talk about them, and it states that breaks of 5 to 20 minutes in length must be paid by the employer. In order to be unpaid, that break needs to be at least 30 minutes of uninterrupted time. Whoops, I gave the answer. You cannot allow your non-exempt staff to take their meal breaks the last hour of work. True. None. Don't give people their breaks in their first hour or last hour of work. That's not allowed. Next question. Your non-exempt staff can combine their breaks to come in late or go home early. False. Don't let your employees combine their breaks to leave early or extend lunch. That defeats the purpose of the break. And in some states, it's illegal. You must pay overtime for work done on any and all holidays. True or false? False. This is a common thing that we hear on the hotline. Only government entities mandate special pay for work done on holidays. Every organization gets to decide if they're going to have premium pay for work done on a holiday. It's up to you and your policies and practices. So there are no state or federal requirements for private employers to provide premium pay or overtime pay for work done on a holiday. That is up to each and every organization. There are no state laws with that either. If you know that one or more of your exempt staff is going to be working extra, say a Saturday event, you may modify their work hours early in that same week to avoid overtime. True. You have the ability to modify work schedules of your non-exempt employees to avoid overtime. Now, that is easiest done in states with weekly overtime rather than daily overtime. If your state has daily overtime, you still can modify with daily overtime. It's just a little bit more awkward because you're doing, an hour here, and you still can't go over that 8 hours. But if you're in a state where it's weekly overtime, you can definitely have somebody not come to work one day during that work week and work on the Saturday to avoid overtime. Next question. If an employee earns overtime in 1 week, let's say they work 42 hours in a work week, you have the right to schedule them less the next week to avoid paying overtime. True or false? False. You must still pay the overtime. However, from a budgetary viewpoint, you can modify their hours that next work week by 3 hours to stay on budget. So you can have them work 3 hours less that following week to stay on budget. If you have an employee that is late turning in their timesheet, you can delay paying them until they turn in their timesheet. True or false? False. Now, the question I have for you, and I want you all to chime in. I'm going to expand this so I can see. What can you do or should you do if you have an employee that is late with their timesheet? You have to pay them on time. So what can you do or should you do if you have somebody that is late turning in their timesheet and you know that you can't delay paying them until they turn in their timesheet? Great. Carrie says, pay average hours for a certain time period. Exactly. Yes. And Dana says, discipline the employee and give a warning. Exactly. Yes. So you definitely have to pay them on time. No, you can't charge it to their PTO, but you definitely need to go back, and if you know that they typically work 35 hours or 20 hours or whatever it is, then best guess, you need to pay them those average hours. And definitely you can discipline them. Usually I would do a warning with somebody if it was a one-time thing. But if it's something that they do week after week, you definitely want to discipline them. You can even terminate somebody for multiple offenses. So we've got a lot of comments and questions here. Let me see. You would adjust their payment, right? If you overpaid, you could definitely adjust that time. The question is, what if they make a mistake on their timesheet? Let's say they leave off hours. When does that need to be paid? That's a great question, Michael. That depends on your state. States have pretty specific laws, like California has very specific laws. Next question is, you pay only the base week and wait on the overtime until you know what it is based on the submitted timesheet. Correct. Now, to expand on that, again, it depends upon the state you're in. You may have to cut a separate check more quickly for the overtime earned in some states than in others. Somebody uses an EVV system for time. If they fail to clock in, can you delay their pay? No, you cannot. So next question. You can hold a final paycheck until all items, let's say somebody's leaving. That final paycheck, cell phone, uniform, keys, operation manuals, maybe a laptop are returned. True or false? Can you hold a final paycheck until they've turned everything in? True or false? False. Let me get back over here. Whoop. I am not here. Sorry about that. False. You can never hold or delay payment of wages in all steps. Great. Thanks, Ramona. You are correct. False. You cannot ever delay or hold a payment of wages. So somebody says, we have established published deadlines for hourly workers to turn in timesheets to meet payroll, and the needed time frame. Okay, I'm not quite sure what the question is there. How should adjustments be made to time cards after the employee signed off if an error was made? That's a great question, and I'm not going to go into that now because it depends on your state. Best practice is just quickly to make sure somebody that the employee initials it. If you know that they've missed something, go ahead and add it. If it's not in their favor, it's a little bit more cumbersome, but you definitely can make changes, but you need to make sure that there are proper initials. Question here, can you deduct fees for the cost of those items? I would never do that on somebody's final paycheck. There are and in some states, the answer is never. It's like the cost of doing business. However, you can call the police and report them as stolen because they haven't returned them. Small claims court, there are other ways to go about it. Let's see, can you adjust from a direct deposit to cut a paper check for last payment to attempt to get employee to comply with turning in items? That's a great question, and I would not do that. You have to make sure that you pay people on, certain states have certain laws for timing. Let's say California. If you have an employee that gives you at least 72 hours notice that they are quitting their job, you must have their final paycheck that day, their last day. If you fire somebody in the state of California, when you fire them, you must hand them their final check. So we've got a lot more questions coming in. Again, Mac, if you can note where we are here, I'll get to those later. Let's keep going. It's good to have a policy and/or practice that employees will only be paid overtime for hours worked over 40 hours in a work week if the overtime was pre-authorized. True or false? False. It is great to have a policy regarding pre-authorized overtime. However, if the employee works overtime, regardless of pre-authorization, you must pay them, and you must pay them timely. You can, of course, discipline them or fire them if this is an ongoing issue. However, you must pay them. Verbal contracts are considered best practices. True or false? False. Regardless of whether it's an employee or an independent contract, make sure everything is in writing. Now, we are segueing into independent contractor status. I want to make sure that you have a written contract in place for every independent contractor that's working for you. Not a verbal contract, a written contract. And I want you to make sure that that contract has a provision where it explains why they are classified as independent contracts. Now, I want you to remember that independent contracts should be project-based. Make sure that that contract specifies services and sets the terms of the project, and make sure that it mentions that an independent contractor is not entitled to benefits because they are not employees. Also, remember that to pay independent contractors as billed, not on a set schedule and never through payroll. That should be an account receivable and account payable. It is not payroll because they are not employees. Next question. It is a red flag to the IRS if someone receives a W-2 and a 1099 in the same year from the same organization. True or false? True. If you do this, and I advise that you do not, but if you do, be sure to clearly document why somebody is receiving both a W-2 and a 1099 in the same year, and save whatever. I have evidence down here. Save your documentation. When a worker receives both a W-2 and a 1099 from the same business in the same year, it is a red flag in the IRS's system. The IRS is going to assume that you are trying to avoid paying taxes on part of the employee's wages. The odds are very high that you and the worker will be contacted to explain why it happened. You will need to prove that you are correct. Now, in order for somebody to qualify as an independent contractor, the following must exist. The individual has a legitimate independent business. They are not other clients. They have other clients that are not connected to the employer, meaning that that independent contractor must not be economically dependent solely upon you. That independent contractor, the work done by the independent contractor should never be identical or even similar to what they did as an employee or what other employees do. Now, when doing 1099 work, the independent contractor must meet the common law test. Now, the common law rules are facts that provide evidence of the degree of control and independence that that person has and fall into three categories. Behavioral. First one is behavioral. Does the organization control or have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does their job? Number two, financial. These are the common law rules. Behavioral, financial. Are the business aspects of the worker's job controlled by the payer? These are things that include how the worker is paid, whether expenses are reimbursed, who provides tools and supplies, etc. And the third common law rule is the type of relationship. Are there written contracts or employee-type benefits, like pensions, medical coverage, vacation? If it's an independent contractor, there should never be those sorts of things. And here's a big question. Will the relationship continue? And is the work performed a key aspect of the business? Those are things that you need to ask yourself. Next question. It's totally fine to have employees and independent contractors doing the same work. True or false? Well, false. We've just talked about that. Never engage a contractor to do the same work as current employees. Never convert an employee to a contractor to do the same or similar work as an employee. And a reminder that a temporary employee is typically never an independent contractor. Our CFO is an independent contractor and supervises 2 part-time employees. This is a key role to the organization, and this is perfectly acceptable under the independent contractor rules. True or false? False. That CFO's role, that's an integral, super important role to the success of the organization. Furthermore, supervising employees is not what an independent contractor would do. So the IRS is going to look at the extent to which the work performed is an integral part of the employer's business. And according to the Department of Labor, a true independent contractor's work is unlikely to be integral to the employer's business. So the DOL has a really good example, and it uses a construction company that frames homes. So carpenters, the people who are doing the framing, are integral. They're super important to the business, while a software developer that's hired to create software to assist in business management, while important, isn't integral to the business. Next question. The IRS pays close attention to the economic aspects of the relationship between an independent contractor and the purchaser of their services. True or false? True. So back in 2015, the Department of Labor issued an administrator's interpretation on the application of the FLSA's, their suffer or permit standard in identifying employees who are misclassified. So that's the standard, that if somebody is suffered or permitted to work, then they're probably employees. This new the interpretation didn't include a new test for determining worker classification, but it re-emphasized the Department of Labor's belief that most workers are employees under the FLSA, and that they're going to look closely at the economic aspects of the relationship. Okay, we have a question, one that I'm going to take the time to answer because it's a good question here. Well, they're all good questions, but so the comment is, our executive director is a contracted employee, but the contract has a 30-day provision for terminating the relationship. That's fine. A contracted employee is different than an independent contractor, because that your executive director is still considered an employee. There's a contract in place that it defines more clearly what the person is doing, and there's other things in the contract. So that's perfectly fine, and I'm assuming that as a contracted employee, you're paying that employee as an employee, that your executive director, and providing benefits and all that sort of stuff. All right, next question. It is perfectly, I'm going to go back a bit. I want to talk a little bit more at the opportunity for profit and loss and a few other things. So for independent contractors, they're going to look at that economic aspect. That person, that contractor, has to have an opportunity for profit or loss, depending on how well they manage their business beyond that current assignment. So, for example, making decisions on whom to hire in their company that they run as an independent contractor, advertising their services, purchasing goods that they need to do their business, negotiating contracts, and which jobs to take. They're also going to look at the relative investment of the employer and the worker, and it must be significant in nature and magnitude in order for that to qualify as an independent contractor. So I have another good example of this. It's a worker providing cleaning services who occasionally brings her own cleaning supplies to certain jobs, versus a worker who invests in a work use only vehicle. So we're talking about a cleaning service. They've got vans or trucks that they bought for their business. They rent space to store those vehicles and materials. They advertise their services. They hire help for larger jobs. So they purchase material and equipment. It's not on a job-specific basis, but they bring their own equipment and cleaning supplies to each and every work site. So one of the questions we get on the hotline sometimes is, we have an employee that wants to earn extra money, so now they're going to clean our building, and we're going to pay them as an independent contractor. That's not that would be illegal, because they're not an independent contractor unless they've started a new business and they're doing that for others and they've got insurance, etc. Now, the Department of Labor does point out that the first worker's investment is minimal. Let's say they only bring They're clean. They use what's there. And that would show you that that's probably an employment relationship, while the latter, buying the vans and the trucks and the storage unit, etc., may be indicative of an an independent contractor relationship. Independent contractors, that whole thing it's a big area. So next question. It is perfectly fine to be the independent contractor's only client and be solely dependent on your business. True or false? False. An independent contractor should have other clients. Don't be their first or only customer. Remember that economic dependence thing. Now, somebody has to be the first, but make sure that you go through the steps to make sure that it is truly a company that you're working with. All right, we're on the home stretch here. Harry White, editor-in-chief of the Daily Planet, has a former employee, Lois Lane, who is a terrific reporter and wants to come back to work full-time for the Daily Planet. The problem is Lois has moved to another state, has a new baby, and wants to work from home. Harry thinks it would be a great idea to hire Lois as an independent contractor and pay her through payroll at $50 per every hour she works. That's a similar rate that Harry pays his other reporters that work for the Daily Planet. This is a bad idea, and Lois doesn't really qualify as an independent contractor. Or does she? True or false? True. She does not qualify. So let's think about what we've talked about. She's talking about full-time work. They're talking about paying her by the hour. It's the same work as other employees. They're going to pay her through payroll and not accounts payable. Now, how might this work? Let's say Lois she does reporting and writes stories for the New Yorker and for People magazine and for the Daily Planet. There she is, she's got other clients. So and then she's going to bill for each article that she writes. That might be a true independent contractor relationship. So if you incorrectly classify a worker as an independent contractor, you may be responsible for their unpaid federal and state income tax, penalties, and interest. True or false? True. If the IRS determines you have misclassified an employee as an independent contractor, you will pay a percentage of income tax that should have been withheld on their wages and be liable for your share of FICA, workers' comp, unemployment, along with penalties and interest. If you incorrectly classify a worker as an independent contractor, you may be responsible for providing missed benefits. True or false? True. You may be on the hook for missed benefits such as medical insurance, vacation time, sick time, holiday pay, pensions, and there are likely to be interest and penalties on top of that. Employers can face large penalties for misclassifying a worker as an independent contractor, including civil and criminal penalties. True or false? True. If the misclassified worker has not paid their self-employment taxes, guess what? You are likely to be liable for those as well, including, of course, those penalties and interest. And lastly, there could be civil and/or criminal liability if the IRS determines that those misclassifications were willful and/or pervasive. All right, here's another opportunity. I want you all to play along. Bonus question. Great. Carrie, I'm going to read your response. Good. What do you call an organization that believes it doesn't have the time to spend on the intricacies of employment law and believes that it's okay to not comply with certain laws and regulations? What do you call that person? Great. Carrie and Ava, you have the same answer. Out of business. Great. Irresponsible, Alicia says. A failing business. Litigation. One that went out of business. Careless. You guys are spot on. Stupid and ready for, yes, These are great. So my answer was the defendant. You guys are all correct as well, Crocs. Or I think you mean crooks. That's good though. Great. So real quick here. This is great. So lawsuit waiting to happen, exactly. So I've got some takeaways for you. Some things that, to remember. You should pay non-exempt staff for all hours, all hours over in a week at time and a half. If your organization provides meals and breaks, make sure all meals and breaks are free from work or pay them for working. Audit your exempt positions annually and keep the documentation. Make sure you pay all non-exempt staff at least your state minimum wage or the federal, whichever is higher. Exempt and non-exempt classifications are determined by job duties and not what someone's title is. Make sure non-exempt employees record all hours actually worked. Remember, the FLSA has strict record-keeping rules. We suggest adding a statement to your time card that says, and it doesn't have to be this one, but this is just an example. I agree I have accurately recorded the hours worked for the current pay period and have taken all meals and breaks offered. Do not dock exempt staff for hours not worked in a day. Don't jeopardize that exempt status. Analyze the potential worker relationship. Make sure there is a written contract in place for each independent contractor working for you. Make sure it explains why they're classified as an independent contractor, and make sure it states that they are not entitled to benefits. And document your justification. Make sure that independent contractors are issued 1099s. Confirm that all employees receive W-2s and never 1099s. Maintain all these records. And when in doubt, don't do it. If you're not sure, make sure you don't. Now, Carrie, if you could email me, that would be great, and I will make sure that I get you the takeaways. They should be in your slides as well. So I know that there were a bunch of questions that we didn't get to. I wanted to honor your time. I will stay online and go through the questions. Mac, do you want to feed them to me? How do you want to do this?
You're doing better than I could by just reading them to you. So,
okay. All right.
So yeah, and just so everybody knows, you have the copy of the questions. The complete slide deck is going to be emailed to everybody in about an hour, so you'll get everything.
And if you have questions that I don't, your takeouts were not included in the slides. They should have been, because I just went through them. Thank you very much. You're very kind. So here's my email address, a phone number. If you have a question based on what we've gone over, I will go back and yes, you do get SHRM credits. Mac, you want to go over that again? How people get their credits? Right.
So when Sonia gets done, she'll log off. Everybody's going to get a copy. The survey will pop up at the end. Just indicate which credit you need. If you don't have time to hang on, you'll get an email later today with the same survey in it that allows you to tell us what credit you need from us. So that'll be coming either as soon as she's done or later today by email. So if you got to go to lunch, you got to go to lunch.
Right. All right. So I'm going to try to find where we left off and answer as many questions as I can that I didn't get to.
I've been deleting the ones that you answered, so you should be able to just start at the top and work your way down.
All righty. So we have a question from Tom. If a supervisor manages 10 seasonal employees for 6 months, would that be 5 full-time equivalents from an executive exemption purpose? Good question. And perhaps, it depends. So you'd have to figure out the math and make sure that it equals 80 hours of paid work per week, and that supervisor truly is managing them, directing them, setting their hours, coaching, counseling, all the things that we talked about that would fall under the executive exemption. Okay, we did answer about the handouts. An example of an exempt position. So an example of an exempt position would be your CFO, your Chief Financial Officer. It could be your finance director. It could be a fund development person. It could be your HR director. It would not be an executive assistant unless they truly had control over, let's say, the person that they are assisting. Your administrative assistants are probably not exempt. Your receptionist is not exempt. Your bookkeeper is probably not exempt, but your finance director may be. Let's see. Can an employer require an exempt? Oh, we talked about that one. Move through the PTO. Track exempt hours, we talked about that one. Your state has wage-based hire, we talked about that one. Can an employer require? We talked about that one. Okay, here's one. Oh, Maggie left, but we're gonna, in making certain I heard you correctly, if a person supervises only one 40-hour per week employee and no others, they would not be able to be considered an exempt employee for that reason. That is not true. They may qualify, so they would not qualify under the executive exemption, but they might qualify under the administrative exemption as long as they meet those criteria that, they use discretion and independent judgment, that they are doing non-routine, non-manual work, etc. So they may, even if somebody supervises one person or two part-timers and doesn't meet that 80-hour rule, they won't qualify under the executive exemption, but they may qualify under the administrative one. Let's see, payout. Okay, good. Oh, those were answers to, right? We talked about those. We have established published deadlines for hourly workers to turn in timesheets to meet payroll demands and the needed time. I'm not sure what the question was there. How should adjustments be made to time cards? We talked about that. We talked about that one. Can you adjust? We talked about that one. Okay. So this kind of hits on turning things in, back to holding paychecks. Can an organization require all clinical documentation be complete before paying the employee, since it is a requirement and a medical record is part of a legal document? Great question, but April, the answer is no. You can, hopefully that person is professional and they're going to do it because it's part of their job that they were paid to do. But you cannot hold someone's pay ever. You just legally cannot do it. Cheryl says, for a high school, it is permitted to have an independent part-time contractor, not an employee, to teach a class, grade papers, communicate with parents, and be considered part of the faculty of a school. Is it permitted? That's an employee in my book, and it probably should be a contract employee, that you're very clear on the parts of the job and what is required. But that, in my estimation, in my professional opinion, I'm not a lawyer, but in my professional opinion, that would be an employee. That teacher would be an employee and might be a contract employee, but would not be an independent contractor, because I'm assuming they are not teaching at other schools at the same time. So another April has a question. If they sign a release, an employee signs a release, they recognize that they will have to pay a certain dollar amount if they do not turn in a laptop or cell phone. Is that permitted? Yes, but you're still not going to deduct it from their final paycheck in most states. So many of these pay things are based upon what your state laws are. In California, you could not do that. In other states, you might be able to do that. So it depends upon what state you're in. Can you put hourly employee on leave if they can't produce a paycheck, such as on a weekend? Oh, no, you wouldn't want to put somebody on leave if you can't produce the paycheck. You would typically, if somebody's last day is on a weekend, and again, it depends upon what state you're in. Some states allow you to pay somebody who leaves, a departing employee, that next pay period, but not in California. Some states have pretty strict laws on when you pay a departing employee. So in California, if somebody gives you 72 hours notice or 2 weeks notice that their last day is on a Saturday and they work their shift, in California, you better have that final check waiting where they work on that Saturday or Sunday. Next question, social worker. One of our social workers has a master's and is on our payroll. The other one is an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker, I'm guessing, and is a contract employee. They basically do the same job except that they also train staff. Well, you say contract employee, so that's the difference there. The contract employee is still, you're paying taxes on that employee. That contract employee is probably still having workers' comp. You know, they're reporting them for workers' compensation, unemployment, that sort of thing. It all has to do with taxes. If that person is an independent contractor and is doing what you say, that's probably not correct. Contract employee is fine. Just means that there's a contract in place for that employee, but you're still paying the employment taxes on them and deducting for, you know, their federal and state taxes. And they're going to get a W-2, not a 1099. Let's see. We talked about that. Okay. Let me see if anything at the bottom. Thanks, guys. Okay, Delana says, is this something that the IRS audits immediately or audits anything else years later? Well, that's a great question. It depends on what gets flagged for the IRS. If you give that W-2 and a 1099, that does send up a red flag in their system, and they are likely to make some phone calls. It doesn't mean that they're going to audit you necessarily. They may, but it depends on if phone calls are made. When there's an audit, that's why I really encourage you guys to keep really good records and make sure things are documented. You know, why somebody is an independent contractor. Make sure that you have a valid explanation as to why. Let's see, credits, yes. Meal and break statement. Oh, great. Well, Carrie, that should be in your slides. And like Max said, those will be sent out after, if you weren't able to download it, the slide deck will be sent out after I log off. And let's see if there's anything else. Thank you so much. Another question on independent contractors. So we have a translator for the Head Start program that we pay by hour as needed. Do we need a contract for her or just a bill for services? If this person has a business who's a translator and this person goes from organization to organization, then that's probably an independent contractor. It could also be a contract employee that this person works hourly as needed and is called in and then is paid through payroll. However, if you're paying them as an independent contractor and you're not deducting the required taxes and counting for workers' compensation and unemployment, then so you need to decide what the person is. And it may be if they have a true business as a translator for other organizations and has liability insurance, etc., then they could be an independent contractor or they could be a part-time employee. Can you deduct an exempt employee from their salary for full days missed after all their sick and vacation has been used? Amelia asks, yes, you can. Full day increments only. So good question. Patty, like Max said, the slide deck will get sent out, and it should have everything that I've covered, in the slides that you've seen on your screen. Let's see, final. Oh, okay, Jessica, you must be in California. So I'll go back. For those of you not in California, our minimum salary requirement is much higher than the federal. So, and it is based on, California's rule is based on the state minimum wage. And for those with fewer than 25 employees, I believe, or 26 employees, it is one rate, and then you double that rate to get the minimum. If you're a larger employee, it's 50 cents higher, and again, you double that. So, Jessica, if you're in California, you're 40. Oh, I see what you're saying. No. So that final rule, that 913.47.476, is not in place for the salary minimum. That was part of the Obama overtime rule, for lack of a better name for it. That did not go through. Another question. Administrative assistant is not exempt. So remember that, so the question was, I had made a statement that administrative assistants are typically not exempt. Administrative assistants typically, and again, you're going to have to go through the job description and define how much authority and independent judgment and discretion that person has. Or are they doing manual work? They're entering information into the computer. Are they writing reports that somebody has given them? Are they doing a lot of data entry? That would be considered non-exempt work. Let's see. Our regular business is Monday through Friday. If an exempt employee calls in sick one day of the week but works Saturdays, could we still charge a sick day for them? You could. Amelia asks, our regular business works Monday through Friday, but you probably have a 7-day week. So you need to look more closely at how it's defined. So if an exempt employee calls in sick one day but works Saturdays, see, I would not. The thing with exempt staff is you've got to separate them from thinking about them on an hour-by-hour basis. Remember those minimum requirements. Typically, your exempt staff, the assumption is that they work more than a 40-hour work week. So if somebody's sick one day, but they're going to come in and they're going to do their work on a Saturday, I probably would not charge them a sick day, because you're treating them more like a non-exempt employee. Another question, does someone that makes over $47,000 qualify for exempt status? Well, it depends. It depends on if they qualify. Remember, it's a three-pronged test. You've got salary, a minimum salary, they're paid on a salary basis, and then their job duties. So just paying somebody a high salary does not mean that they are automatically exempt. It depends on what their job duties are as well as how much they make. Another question, we have a salaried staff of 50, both exempt and non-exempt, but we also have hundreds of direct care staff that must turn in approved hourly timesheets for the pay period, signed by the client family. These timesheets are run in an established published payroll that has a deadline for receiving, trying to get to the bottom of this, sorry, I can only see part of it, receiving timesheets in order to get them processed and submitted to the payroll processor and checks returned. If the variable hours employee misses the deadline, we hold the timesheet for the next. No, that is not legal anywhere. So no, you have to pay them based, then you have to make the assumption that the hours that they worked the week before or on average is what they worked this pay period. You can discipline them if somebody is late in getting their timesheet, signed timesheet to you, but you cannot delay their payment, not legally. Okay, another question here. Head Start managers be exempt. They do not supervise anyone. They do not hire or fire. They do not have final decision making. Okay, good question. They may be exempt under the administrative qualification. That just depends upon their level of authority and decision making. So they don't have to have unilateral final decision making. However, if their input, if they say, I really, here's what's going on, and this is the direction I believe we should go in, and their manager or CEO says, okay, great, let's move forward, they may qualify under the administrative exemption, maybe. Oh, comp time. Question is it okay to offer comp time versus pay overtime for time worked over 40 hours in a work week? No. No, never. You've got to pay them. And don't do comp time for your exempt staff either, because then you're treating them as a non-exempt employee. Let's see. Another question. Our payroll and app person makes $60,000. She's listed as exempt and considers herself exempt, but tells us she's not responsible for creating the coding or making the decision. She says she works her 40 hours plus and rotates her hours based on the workload. Should she be exempt or non-exempt? That's a great question. Mac, I have some worksheets. And I think the worksheets, I'd like to make the worksheets available for everybody. I can't make these decisions for you all. You need to go through a process. And Mac will send out the worksheets, an administrative worksheet and an executive exemption worksheet that will help you make some decisions. So again, it goes back to salary. Looks like that person definitely qualifies based on what she's paid. But it's that level of responsibility. So coding, I'm not sure what you mean by coding. If you're talking about entering payroll to me would be a non-exempt position. So because you're doing the same thing each pay period. If you're just entering information in, that is not an exempt level duty. Oh, she's an independent contractor. Oh, who? I don't know which one that went to. That was probably the teacher. Let's see. Can you take an agreed upon amount by employer and employee out of paycheck for equipment such as, oh, we did talk about that one. Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Let me see. I think somehow can an exempt employee work over 100 hours biweekly and not receive overtime? If they're exempt, they can work 100 hours a week. Exempt folks never receive overtime pay. They're not entitled to overtime pay. If you choose to reward somebody, then that's up to each and every organization. I would be careful and not be tracking hours and paying somebody overtime that you consider exempt. So be careful with that. Oh, thank you. Mac, somebody is asking about a recording.
Yes, everybody's going to get a copy of the recording later today.
Okay. Somebody asked about distinct rules for teachers, and that's a good question. And there are some different rules for teacher. And if you'd like, you can give me a call, and we can talk about that. Because the salary level for a teacher is different. There often is not. It depends on what state you are in. Okay, I'm trying to get down to the bottom here. Great. I think let's see. My scrolling thing messed up, so let me see. Can you adjust a direct deposit to cut a paper check? I think we talked about that one. To attempt to get employee to comply with turning in their items. I wouldn't do that because still, you still need to pay, whether it's direct deposit or a paper check, you still need to pay them on their final day. However your state laws are, whatever your state laws are. Keep skipping up here. I'm sorry about this. For some reason, when I answer a question, it skips up. Full-time staff uses. Okay, if a full-time hourly staff uses all earned sick time, can they just not be paid for any additional sick time? That is a good question. When you say full-time hourly, they're non-exempt because you're paying them hourly, so they're non-exempt. And if they use all their sick time and they're sick another time and there's no, then yes, you can either let them go in the hole and they have a negative sick time balance, or it's time without pay. You bet. Okay. General ledger coding. I'm not quite sure what that is. So, but typically, if it's entering information, Arlen has I was talking about the payroll. If it's entering information and it's the same sort of information every month, they're probably non-exempt. Shoot, why is this? Let's go. Okay. Oh, good question here. If you terminated an employee and you happen to overpay on the final check, can you basically get reimbursement on that overpayment? That is a good question, and well, you can ask. You can certainly ask, show your proof that you overpaid them, and then ask them to reimburse you for that overpayment. That may be very difficult to do. You could probably go after them in small claims court. Sometimes that's just what happens, and it's the cost of doing business. You can demand it, but it doesn't mean you're going to get it. So, all right, I think I'm done here. I know it's 10:30 my time. That's what, 1:30 on the East Coast, 12:30 Midwest. So lunchtime for many of you. If you have questions on what we've talked about, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. And like Max said earlier, he's going to send out the slide deck, and I'm going to make those worksheets available to you all. So hopefully that will help. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mac?
All righty. Thank you, ma'am. And like we said, we'll get everything to you all later today in an email, and we'll get the notes and everything in there for you as well. If you have any questions, you have Sonia's information. Please don't call me about this stuff because I'll just have to refer you to Sonia. All righty. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.